Hi there, my name's Neve and I make historical replicas in Minecraft. Welcome to a pretty much exact replica of the witch house in Salem, Massachusetts. I hope you enjoyed our quick fly around tour. If nerding out over historical sites isn't your thing, feel free to leave now. But if it is, feel free to join me for a full-on tour of the museum as we go ahead and read some of the panels that I've transposed from the real museum into books on display around the house. That also includes some information from my own research about the Salem witch trials. Welcome to the witch house. The witch house was the home of Judge Jonathan Corwin, 1640 to 1718, and is the only structure still standing in Salem with direct ties to the Salem witch trials of 1692. In 1675, Jonathan Corwin, heir to one of the largest Puritan fortunes in New England, purchased this large and stately house. 17 years later, Corwin and his family would take part in the most famous witch hunt in American history. Through examination of family life, architecture, and furniture of the 17th century, visitors to the house gain a deeper comprehension of the people involved in the witch trials and an enriched understanding of America's colonial heritage. The newly arrived colonists travelled from England with their fears of witchcraft fully intact. Accusations, witch hunts, and trials were a familiar and accepted part of their lives. Indeed, within a short time of settling these shores, there were a number of trials, and even executions, for what was considered a capital and felonious crime. Certainly the largest and most famous of these unfortunate episodes are the Salem witch crises of 1692. Beginning in the early winter months of 1692 and carrying on until May of the following year, the people of the colony would see 19 people hanged for the crime of practicing witchcraft. Charms in the hallway. Poppets. Bridget Bishop was the first victim to be executed. Part of the evidence presented against her was the claim that workmen found poppets buried within the walls of her home. For centuries, people have placed items under hearthstones, floorboards, and inside their walls to bring the house blessings and to protect the inhabitants from bad spirits. Bones, dolls, written charms, and clothing have all been found. The most common items are shoes. Experts believe that the well-worn shoes are utilized in the hopes of imbuing the house with the protective spirit of the person who wore them. Most often just one shoe is found, and this is believed that this is so the spirit can't walk off. Witch bottles. Another common form of folk magic was the placement of witch bottles in the hearth. Hair, fingernails, and urine collected from the occupants within the home were placed inside glass or clay vessels and were believed to keep bad spirits and witches at bay. To this unsavory concoction were added iron nails or pins, and then the tightly sealed bottle was placed upside down beneath the fireplace. Cotton Mather warned against the practice, but did allow that sharp pins or nails were a necessary ingredient for the endeavour to be successful. Witch cakes. A well-documented case of an act of counter-magic being performed happened on February 25th, 1692. Mary Sibley, a member of Paris's congregation, instructed Tituba and John Indian, Tituba's husband, to bake a witch cake. This was done in an effort to find the identity of the witch afflicting Reverend Paris's daughter and niece. The afflicted girl's urine was to be mixed with rye flour and fed to a dog. The belief was that the essence of the witch was retained in the victim's water and would feel the pain of the dog's teeth as it chewed. This and other forms of counter-magic were seemingly performed often, and were the subject of many sermons warning against the danger of going to the devil to find the devil by Puritan ministers. Mary Sibley was required by Reverend Paris to apologize to the congregation for her transgression. She was never accused of witchcraft. So this is the hallway of the house, and on display are a variety of charms, including witch bottles and witch cakes and poppets. So I suppose we'll move on now into the first room on the left. So this room is essentially kind of the main living quarters. So let's read a bit about what goes on in here. That's Corwin himself, the master of the house. Let's read a bit more about him. The Corwin family. The witch house was once the home of Jonathan Corwin, a wealthy merchant and politician. It was his role as magistrate and judge that forever galvanized his presence in the Salem witch trials, one of the most tragic events in early American history. As an influential merchant from a prominent local family, he was appointed to the position of town selectman and representative, and was deeply involved in the affairs of Salem town long before the witch hysteria of 1692. As a member of the militia, he was relied on to make decisions that affected the lives of hundreds of colonists. Corwin served on the court of Oyer and Terminer. He was involved in the proceedings of the specialized court that saw over 150 people arrested, 19 people hanged, and one individual pressed to death for allegedly practicing witchcraft. Corwin was the heir to one of the largest Puritan fortunes known in Massachusetts Bay. Nevertheless, he married an extremely wealthy widow from Boston named Elizabeth Gibbs in 1675. In that same year, he purchased this home, a fine mansion by colonial standards. This room was their parlour, or best room. It was here that Jonathan and Elizabeth would have kept their finest imported furnishings and pieces that best conveyed their high station within the community. Social events and dinners would take place here. In this room, Jonathan would also conduct his business as magistrate, hearing cases of petty crime. It is quite possible that some of the witchcraft accusations were recorded in this room. Although Corwin's reputation apparently survived the witch trials intact, a long run of tragedy befell his household. Elizabeth had been in her mid-20s when she married for the second time to Corwin, bringing her 3 children from Boston to Salem after the marriage. She had given birth originally to 4 children, one of whom had already died. Soon after they moved into the house, her 12-year-old daughter Margaret died, and of the 10 children Elizabeth bore Corwin, only 2 reached adulthood, most dying in the first few years of life. The Corwins and their remaining adult children all died within a few years of each other. Elizabeth died on August 29, 1718, at the age of 73. Let's have a read of this book over here and see what it says. Salem Witch Trials. Victims who were found guilty and executed. Number 1. Bridget Bishop, aged 50s. Bridget Bishop was a widow who lived in Salem town. Bishop had a bad reputation around town because she had been accused of witchcraft years before and had frequent run-ins with the law. She wasn't the first person accused during the Salem witch trials, but she was the first person tried because it was believed the case against her would be easy to win. She was brought to trial on June 2nd, found guilty, and became the first person executed during the witch trials when she was hanged on June 10th, 1692. Number 2. Sarah Good, aged 39. Sarah Good lived in Salem Village and was the wife of William Good. At the time of the witch trials, she was poor and pregnant and would often go door to door in Salem Village, begging for handouts while her husband worked as a day labourer. Good was one of the first people accused of witchcraft during the witch trials, along with Sarah Osborne and Tituba. When the afflicted girls first began showing symptoms that they were bewitched, these girls accused these 3 women of bewitching them. Sarah Good was brought to trial on June 29th and executed on July 19th, 1692. Number 3. Elizabeth Howe, age 57. Elizabeth Howe lived in Topsfield and was the wife of farmer James Howe. She had been accused of witchcraft before. In her previous case, she was accused of bewitching a local girl. No charges were ever brought up against Howe, but she was later refused admittance to an Ipswich church due to the incident. In May of 1692, she was accused of witchcraft by the afflicted girls in Salem Village. She was arrested, brought to trial on June 29th, and executed on July 19th. 4. Susanna Martin, age 71. Susanna Martin was a poor widow who lived in Amesbury at the time of the Salem witch trials. Susanna Martin had also been accused of witchcraft before. In her previous cases, she was accused of infanticide and tormenting people with her spectre. The charges were eventually dropped or dismissed. Martin was accused of witchcraft again by the afflicted girls in the spring of 1692, She was brought to Salem, put on trial on June 29th, and executed on July 19th. 5. Rebecca Nurse, age 71. Rebecca Nurse was an elderly grandmother from Salem Village and the wife of farmer Francis Nurse. She was a pious and popular woman who had a long-standing feud with the Putnam family over border boundaries between their adjoining land. She also disapproved of the controversial appointment of Samuel Parris, who was a close friend of the Putnams, as the new Salem village minister. The Putnams were Rebecca Nurse's main accusers during the witch trials, and many of them testified against her. Rebecca Nurse was originally not found guilty at the end of her trial in late June, but when the verdict was read out loud in the court, the afflicted girls protested, and the jury was asked to reconsider its decision. The jury reconsidered and came back with a guilty verdict. Rebecca Nurse was executed on July 19th, 1692. 6. Sarah Wilds, aged 65. Sarah Wilds lived in Topsfield and was the wife of a local judge, John Wilds. Sarah Wilds had somewhat of a bad reputation due to previous brushes with the law. In 1649, she was accused of fornicating out of wedlock with Thomas Wardwell, and in 1663 she was accused of wearing a silk scarf. After she married widower John Wilds in 1663, John Gouled and Mary Gouled Reddington, the brother and sister of John Wilds' late wife, developed a hatred of Sarah Wilds, and in 1670 began spreading rumours that she was a witch. Even after Mary Gould Reddington passed away from natural causes years later, Mary's friends continued to harass and torment Sarah Wilds. The Gould family were close friends with the Putnam family of Salem Village. Shortly after the Salem witch hunt began in March of 1692, the Putnam family accused Sarah Wilds of witchcraft in April of 1692 and she was arrested. John Wilds' daughter from a previous marriage and son-in-law, Sarah and Edward Bishop, were also arrested, as was John's other daughter, Phoebe Wilds. Sarah Wilds was brought to trial on June 29th and executed on July 19th, 1692. 7. Reverend George Burroughs, age 40s. George Burroughs was the only Puritan minister to be accused and executed during the Salem witch trials. Burroughs was a minister in Costco, Maine during the 1670s, but left the settlement after it was attacked by Native Americans. He later settled in Salisbury, Mass. For a while before being asked to serve as the new minister in Salem Village in 1680. The residents of Salem disagreed over his appointment as minister, and he was not always paid his salary. He often borrowed money from the Putnam family. When he stopped being paid altogether, he left Salem and returned to Maine. At some point, the Putnam family sued Burroughs for failure to repay his debt, and shortly after accused him of witchcraft. Burroughs was arrested, brought to trial on August 5th, and executed on August 19th, 1692. 8. Martha Carrier, age 33. Martha Carrier lived in Andover and was the wife of Thomas Carrier. She was also the niece of outspoken opponent of the Salem witch trials, Reverend Francis Dane of Andover, and the sister of accused witch Mary Toothaker. Carrier was the first person in Andover accused during the Salem witch trials. She was accused by her neighbour Benjamin Abbott after the two had a dispute over land, and Abbott immediately fell ill. Her children were also accused and were coerced into testifying against her. Carrier was brought to trial on August 5th and executed on August 19th, 1692. 9. John Willard, aged 30s. John Willard was a deputy constable in Salem at the time of the Salem witch trials. He was one of the first people in Salem to speak out against the trials. Willard was responsible for helping to arrest the accused witches, but soon began to doubt so many people could be guilty of witchcraft, and quit his job in protest. Shortly after, Willard himself was accused of witchcraft by Anne Putnam, who was also accusing him of beating her baby sister to death. Willard was not immediately arrested, but his in-laws, the Wilkins family, began to grow suspicious of him. Willard was accused a second time by his wife's grandfather, Bray Wilkins, after Wilkins fell ill upon receiving a cross look from Willard in May of 1692. An arrest warrant was issued, but John had fled Salem. He was hunted down and arrested in Nashua, NH. Several confessed witches testified against Willard, as well as an afflicted girl, Ann Putnam Jr., who testified that she saw many ghosts of people Willard allegedly killed. He was brought to trial on August 5th and executed on August 19th, 1692. 10. George Jacob Sr., age 72. George Jacob Sr. was accused of witchcraft by several people during the Salem witch trials, including his granddaughter, Margaret Jacobs. He was a reluctant churchgoer and was an outspoken critic of the Salem witch trials. He was first accused by his servant, Sarah Churchill, who also accused her granddaughter, Margaret Jacobs. His son, George Jacobs Jr., was accused as well, but he evaded arrest. Many people testifying against George Jacobs Sr., including almost all of the members of the Putnam family. He was found guilty on August 5th and executed on August 19th, 1692. Jacob's family reportedly retrieved his body from the execution site and buried him on the family property. 11. John Proctor, age 61. John Proctor was a wealthy farmer who lived on the outskirts of Salem village. He was an outspoken critic of the Salem witch trials and often threatened to beat or whip the afflicted girls for their role in creating the hysteria. After his wife, Elizabeth Proctor, was arrested on charges of witchcraft in April of 1692, the afflicted girls turned on John Proctor during Elizabeth's examination and accused him as well. John Proctor's entire family was eventually arrested on charges of witchcraft. Proctor knew Salem was in the midst of a mass hysteria and wrote a letter to the Boston clergy in July asking that they intervene or move the trials to Boston. The clergy responded, but it was too late. He was put on trial and executed on August 19th, 1692. Alice Parker, age unknown, number 12. Alice Parker was the wife of fisherman John Parker. The couple lived in Salem town, where Alice was known as a pious, honest woman. Parker also had a reputation for clairvoyance, and on one occasion successfully predicted that a friend's husband had died at sea. In May of 1692, afflicted girl Mary Warren suddenly accused Alice Parker of witchcraft. During Parker's trial, Warren made several surprising accusations against her, claiming she bewitched her mother to death, made her sister ill, and drowned several men and boys in the sea, including a man named Thomas Westgate and his entire crew, who drowned after their ship sank. Alice Parker was brought to trial on September 9th and executed on September 22nd, 1692. 13. Mary Parker, aged about 40. Mary Parker was a widow from Andover. Parker was first named a witch by William Barker Jr. and was accused of afflicting Martha Sprague. It is not known why Parker was accused, but she stated during her examination that there was another woman in Andover named Mary Parker, and suggested it was a case of mistaken identity. Sprague then stated that the woman in front of her was the woman who afflicted her. Mary was brought to trial on September 17th and executed on September 22nd, 1692. 14. Anne Puditer, aged in her 70s. Anne Puditer was a widow who lived in Salem town, where she also worked as a nurse and midwife. She had a reputation for being sharp-tongued and often quarrelled with locals. Puditer was accused of witchcraft in May of 1692 by Sarah Churchill and several other afflicted girls of Salem village. Some of her medical supplies, such as foot ointments, were confiscated and introduced to the court as objects of the occult. During her trial, she accused many of her accusers of lying. Puditer was brought to trial on September 9th and executed on September 22nd, 1692. 15. Wilmot Red, age unknown. Wilmot Red lived in Marblehead and was the wife of fisherman Samuel Red. Like Bridget Bishop and many other witch trial victims, Wilmot Red had also been accused of witchcraft before in 1687. She was an unpopular person around town because she often quarrelled with others and had an abrasive personality. Red's daughter was the wife of fellow accused witch Reverend George Burroughs. Red was accused of witchcraft in May of 1692 by the Salem Village afflicted girls and brought to Ingersoll Tavern in Salem Village for her examination. She had never met the afflicted girls before, and when asked why they were afflicted, She stated they were in a sad condition. She went on trial in September and was executed that month on the 22nd. 16. Margaret Scott, age 77. Margaret Scott was a widow from Rowley. Scott had 7 children, but only 3 survived childhood. After her husband died in 1671, Scott was left destitute and forced to beg from her neighbours. This made her unpopular. Scott was accused by 2 of Rowley's most notable families, the Wickhams and the Nilsons. A member of the Nilson family also sat on the grand jury that convicted her. Scott was brought to trial on September 17th and executed on September 22nd, 1692. 17. Samuel Wardwell, aged 49. Samuel Wardwell was a carpenter from Andover. He was also a well-known fortune-teller and practitioner of English folk magic. It is believed that his work in the occult led to his witchcraft accusation. During his examination, he admitted to fortune-telling and dabbling in magic, and said that the devil may have taken advantage of him for these reasons. He then confessed to making a pact with the devil, but later recanted his confession. He was brought to trial in mid-September and executed on September 22nd, 1692. 18. Martha Corey, age 72. Martha Corey lived in the outskirts of Salem village and was the wife of a wealthy farmer, Giles Corey. Corey had a reputation for being a pious member of the community, despite the well-known fact that she had a child out of wedlock in the 1670s. Martha Corey was also an outspoken critic of the Salem witch trials and stated many times that the afflicted girls were liars. During her own examination, she told the judge, "We must not believe all that these distracted children say." In March, Giles Corey testified against his wife in court, stating that she may have bewitched his farm animals and himself. When Giles Corey himself was accused of witchcraft and arrested in April, he refused to provide any more information on Martha or himself. Martha Corey was brought to trial on September 9th and executed on September 22nd, 1692, just 3 days after Giles Corey had been tortured to death for refusing to enter a plea. 19. Mary Easty, age 58. Mary Easty was the sister of accused witches Rebecca Nurse and Sarah Cloyce. She lived in Topsfield and was considered a pious, well-respected member of the community. In 1692, she was accused of witchcraft, arrested, but was then released in May. She was accused again a few days after her release and arrested. She was examined and indicted on 2 charges of witchcraft. Easty was brought to trial on September 9th and executed on September 22nd, 1692. So let's head upstairs next. This book we won't be reading. Let me explain. This book is about one of the particular women who was tried as a witch during the Salem witch trials. I have tried to record reading this book twice, different days, different times of the day, and both times after I finished reading it, my computer crashed and the file got corrupted. So this story in particular doesn't want to be told. So we'll head into the master bedroom and learn about childbirth and herbal remedies and folk healing. The bedchamber. Beds were hung with linen or cotton curtains in the summer and wool curtains in the winter. Drapery kept out light, dust, and drafts. In the winter, drapes would keep heat in the bed. At the end of the canopy bed is a trundle bed for young children, which could be rolled underneath the bed for storage. The door next to the fireplace is very old, possibly original to the house. It leads to a hallway connecting to the children's room and contains a ladder to the attic. The attic was used as another bedroom for children and/or servants. Childbirth. Childbirth in the 17th century was unreliable and a danger to both child and mother. However, plants and tinctures were used to ease the process along. Conception. The knowledge and skill of a midwife could be sought out in various anticipated stages of motherhood. Quite often, if a woman did not feel the quickening of her womb within the first year of marriage, she would seek the advice of a midwife. Remedies to encourage conception were common. Dandelion and burdock were used to cleanse the blood and organs in advance of conception. Lady's mantle was used to balance hormones, and chamomile or St. John's wort were prescribed if anxiety was thought to be the source of the infertility. Morning sickness. Chamomile and meadowsweet were used to stave off nausea. Preparing for delivery. Raspberry leaf and yarrow were prescribed to strengthen and tone the uterus. The birth. Angelica root was thought to ease childbirth and bring on contractions. Shepherd's purse was used to staunch the flow of blood. Groaning beer. Special beer was brewed in anticipation of the birth of a child. It was served to the delivering mother in the hopes that it would fortify her. Groaning cakes. Another custom called for the preparation of groaning or kimble cakes, which would be shared with the first individuals to see the newborn. In some areas, this custom translated into cakes gifted to the first person to see the family on the way to the child's christening. Let's head across the hall to the children's room next and see what's in here. We have 2 books, so let's start over here. Education. Great importance was placed upon the responsibility of each individual being able to read and receive the Word of God. Dame schools were set up in early Massachusetts, teaching boys and girls to read and write and perform other household chores. The boys were encouraged to go on to more formalized schooling, where they were taught to read and write Greek, Latin, and English. It was common for a boy to decide upon further education at university level, or apprenticing in a trade by 13 years of age or earlier. Young girls, however, were not encouraged to write. Women were expected to hone their skills in the decorative arts and social arenas. They were expected to learn skills deemed useful for when they had families of their own. A tuition-based school was established in Salem for boys in 1629. By 1637, it had become a tuition-free school to encourage greater participation from the community. Children of families less well off than the Corwins may still have chosen not to take advantage of this offering, needing the extra hands for help with the crops or the family's livelihood. Rest. Rope beds were very common in colonial Salem. Mattresses stuffed with straw or feathers, if one could afford them, would be held aloft on ropes and tightened periodically with a key. Beds were often hinged to allow the bulk of them to be folded up during the day. Most families did not have a separate room for sleeping, so being able to economize on space during the day was of great benefit. Staying warm in the winter was of paramount concern for wealthy and poor alike. Ambient heat from the lower floors and from the chimney bricks provided some warmth. Fires were banked and left to smoulder, while coals were placed into metal bed warmers and passed quickly under bed covers or blankets so as not to scorch. Families would bundle together, fitting many together in beds. Young children were often sewn into their clothes to ensure warmth. Well, friends, that concludes our tour of the witch house in Salem. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Until next time, take care.